Hey guys, it's Ashley. I was thinking today, it's snowy outside, we've got a blizzard, we've got just tons of snow coming down. I would like to talk about the garden. It just makes me feel like warm, it makes me feel good inside, it makes me excited for summer. It helps keep my faith that summer is coming soon. I've been thinking a lot about where I learned a lot of things that I do in the garden. And a lot of that comes from my grandparents. When I was just a little kid, I was in the garden with my grandma pulling weeds, and it was this totally different experience, and I so cherish those memories. When my grandma was in the garden, I saw her at her most peaceful. I got this feeling like there was nowhere on earth she would rather be. And that has definitely carried over into my passion for gardening, because that's the feeling that I get when I garden. So I was thinking a lot about where I learned a lot of the things that I know about gardening, and a lot of that came from my grandparents. So let's just get to it. These are things that I've been thinking about, that when I think about my grandparents and thinking about gardening, these are the tips that stick out in my mind. First one is regarding green peppers. They grew green peppers every year, and then they would chop them up, put them in the freezer, and use them throughout the rest of the year in their cooking. What my grandma would always say about peppers is that they love to touch leaves. So plant them close enough so that when they're a bigger plant, that they can sort of touch. A lot of these things, I'm not sure about the science. A lot of these things may seem like they have no merit, and maybe they don't, but these are just the little pieces of wisdom that I remember most. The next one is about cucumbers. Now, my grandma always used to say that her mom told her that cucumbers love to be disturbed. So every day when you're looking for cucumbers, it's okay to shake the plants a bit. If you don't have them trellised, pick them up and look for cucumbers that way. That disturbance to the plant is something that they actually really like and is good for them. Tip number 3 is regarding carrots. When you plant your carrots, my grandparents always put a thin layer of sawdust along the row. So you cover them gently with I think there's just like 1/8 of an inch of soil. They are planted very shallow, and then go along and pat them down, and then put a nice thin layer of sawdust on. What that'll do is when you water them, as they're germinating, it helps keep the moisture just a little bit closer and improves the germination rate. Tip number 4 is just sort of a general knowledge about potatoes. When potato plants are growing and they start blooming, a lot of times the flowers are white, pink, or purple. When those potato plants are blooming, that's an indicator to you that those plants are starting to grow potatoes under the soil. Tip number 5 is also to do with potatoes. When you start potato plants, you start from an actual potato called a seed potato. Now, these are potatoes that have not gone through any sort of special treatment process for storage. They've been preserved in more of like their natural state in order to be able to grow another plant. When you start with your seed potatoes, you need to cut them up into pieces, and each of those pieces grows new plants. When you've cut your potatoes up, it's critical that you let those potatoes dry out for 1 to 2 days before you plant them. This is so that it almost creates a bit of a scab over the potato, and it protects it from disease and pests a lot more than if you had not done that. It'll get very dry to the touch and almost like a leathery, rubbery feeling. That's when you know that it's ready to go. Tip number 6 is also potatoes. You can tell that they always grew potatoes because there's a lot of tips here. In fact, whenever they would plant potatoes, they would use my grandpa's potato planter, which is still the planter that we use today. So tip number 6 is regarding potato beetles. They are these little bugs that go at the potato plants, and they just eat the leaves completely clean, which can destroy your potato crop. So they always recommend getting out there early in the morning and picking those potato beetles off those plants, double checking the leaves, bending over, flipping them, turning, whatever you need to do to try to find those little orange eggs that they leave under those leaves that then multiply that pest many-fold. Staying ahead of the potato beetles or potato bugs is critical for a healthy potato harvest. So for tip number 7, we're going to go back to carrots. When you harvest your carrots, if you're intending to have them stay in your fridge or keep them for a more longer term use, it's important that when you harvest them, you don't wash them. You leave the dirt on. When you cut your carrot, you'll notice that sometimes there's still green where in the carrot part that you eat. Now, you want to make sure that you keep cutting down the carrot until you can see no more green. If your carrots go into a longer term storage, but they have that green still on them, that can sprout, which will not keep your carrots as good for as long. Another tip for carrots, tip number 8. Carrots and potatoes, clearly a theme here. This is another storage tip for carrots. When you're storing carrots, you can use old bread bags or some sort of a bag that can breathe. They would take old bread bags, poke holes in them, and then keep your carrots in that. You want to be able to keep most moisture out, but also a little bit of airflow. Tip number 9 from my grandparents. Now, if there was anything that they were really good at with their gardening, it was growing a great vegetable garden and not only eating that stuff fresh, but preserving it for a long time. This one is about onions. In order to have onions store long term, you want to make sure that you go through what's called a curing process, which is to leave them out, ideally in a shaded area, but somewhere with a lot of ventilation. They had a shed that they would often use to do this, so that got a lot of good airflow. And what this does is it dries off the dirt, dries off those outer skins, and allows that onion to be ready for longer term storage. And then they would put them in a very cool room in the upstairs of their house, and they would keep all winter long. Every once in a while they find one that's spoiled, but for the most part, they were eating fresh, raw onions all year round. This curing process takes weeks to days, so it's not something that you want to rush. Okay, tip number 10 is regarding cucumbers. My grandparents always planted cucumbers because they like to make their own pickles. And my grandma's pickles were hands down the best pickles ever. I cannot make pickles even close to them. However, if they had cucumbers that got too big on the plants, they would make what's called refrigerator pickles, which is just a pickle that you can keep right in your fridge. So if you had planned to make pickles and your cucumbers are too large, don't throw them away. Don't think that they're scrap. You can use them for different kinds of pickles or relish that don't require them to be small. Tip number 11 is just general advice for gardening. In the summer, it gets hot. It gets really hot, and it can be miserable to be out in the heat of the day. Not only can it be miserable, but it can lead to sunburn, heat stroke, and other things like that. So the advice from my grandparents to have the best gardening experience is to get out in the morning when it's a little cooler, or the late afternoon, early evening when it's a little cooler as well. Those are the top 11 things that I have for you today. Things that I've been thinking a lot about lately as I think about gardening and things that are coming up. If you have any tips of things that either you've learned or you were taught by somebody, maybe a grandparent, about gardening, please share them in the comments below. It'd be really fun to build on this conversation and see all of the great advice that people give and pass down and pass along that we can all use to grow our gardens and learn together. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful in any way, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to catch all my videos on food preservation and gardening, please subscribe, and we'll see you soon.